Any other questions so far? Well, let's get into some of those questions related to some things connected with the universe and samsara and some other things. So, we mentioned that Jain conception of the universe, that shape. The universe within Jainism consists of three realms. There is the underworld, the middle realm, and then eventually the realm of liberated souls. The universe consists of 6 substances, according to Jainism, but essentially they break down into 2 lines. There are things that are jiva, or have jiva, or soul, and the things that are ajiva, which are non-soul, things like matter, time, space. The underworld is a realm of demons, demigods. It's organized according to a series of colored layers, with the darkest layers being at the bottom. The earth is in the middle realm, which would also include the sky. Jains also believe in this kind of cosmogony that there are many worlds in this middle realm. It is only in this middle realm, this middle earth, where you can achieve liberation. Right? So if you find yourself in any of these areas in the underworld, you cannot be liberated from there to the realm of liberated souls. Instead, it's only in the middle realm. Time for Jains is believed to be cyclical and eternal. The universe does not have a beginning nor an end. But each of the cycles of time is divided into 2 half cycles. Each of those half cycles is divided into 6 21,000-year stages. And so we're talking, long periods of time. In one half of the cycle, conditions in the world go from bad to good. In the other half, of course, is the opposite, right? Good to bad. And it's believed that that bottom point, when a new Tirthankara will arrive, kind of revive everybody and start the ascent, moral ascent. Right? Many Jains would probably say we're somewhere in this 5th stage of decline. Right? So you're getting close to the bottom. Meaning that eventually it will start back the other way. But all of this, these cycles, continue on eternally. Another important concept, of course, as we've already highlighted, is the idea of karma. As we spin on these cycles of time, we accumulate karma. Now, when we talk about karma in Hinduism, karma means action that's connected specifically with rewards and punishments related to moral action. Karma, however, in Jainism is material, it's matter. Karma consists of these minute particles that accumulate on our souls as we act, as we speak, as we think. Karma is especially attractive to souls that have lots of desires. They tend to be considered to be wet. And so it's easier for karma to attach. Detachment from the world, like exhibited by Mahavira, makes your soul drier, makes it harder for karma to attach. The accumulation of these karmic particles on our souls keeps that soul in bondage to samsara. But the soul, of course, is colored by these karmic particles. Remember, we mentioned the underworld being of these different shades. Right? The more karma you have on in your soul, the darker it will be. as long as a soul continues to have karmic particles, it will be reborn. When rebirth happens, there are essentially 4 different types of beings that you can be reborn into. Obviously, human beings. The most desirable state for rebirth is as a human being. It is only human beings that can be liberated from samsara. It's believed that only human beings have the ability to learn the difference between good and evil. They're the only ones that have the ability to exercise restraint and detachment and achieve liberation. However, one might also be reborn as a heavenly being. Jains believe in the existence of heavenly beings, many of them, as we just mentioned, all right, the gods of Hinduism. But these heavenly beings are not eternal. They are not God in the classic Christian, Jewish, Muslim sense of what God, all eternal, responsible for creation of the world, etc. Right? So Jains don't believe in a creator God, supreme creator God, always eternal, always existent. The world has always existed. It's always been there. It's eternal. So these heavenly beings are not exactly the same kind of thing as what other people would talk about when they talk about gods. And so in some respects, these heavenly beings are trapped in samsara. They're subject to the universe, right? They're not responsible for it. They don't exercise ultimate control over it. But they do have superior and supernatural abilities. They have enormous luxuries at their disposal. But because of this, they are really unable to exercise restraint. They're unable to renounce their life. And they become very attached to their luxurious life, so they cannot achieve liberation. It's also important to note that the heavenly being's time is limited. Eventually it will come to an end, and then they will be reborn in one of the other types of beings. Now, one can be reborn as a heavenly being through merits and meditation, but again, it's better to be reborn as a human. On the other end, one could be reborn as an animal or a plant or a bacteria or a virus, sitting in a petri dish. This is my cousin Fred. Passed away, was a horrible guy, using him for science experiments now. So essentially, you can be reborn as an animal or a plant if you've been unethical, if you've been too attached to possessions, too attached to desires. It is believed that some higher forms of animals can think, and so that's why, there's the possibility of this consciousness or soul, but not as well as human beings, so you cannot be liberated as an animal. But those higher forms of animals, it's believed that you can exercise some control. Because you would say, well, how do you get reborn from a plant, right? You're a palm tree. Right? How do you get out of being a palm tree? Well, the idea is that you could be reborn as a higher form of plant, and then maybe a lower form of animal, and then a higher form of animal, enough where you can get to the point where you can exercise restraint to eventually become reborn as a human being. But all of this, to kind of give a caveat, it's not intricately thought out, right? There's not explanations for everything. And so exactness is difficult. But if, as an animal, you live a life of desires and even violence, you would continue to be reborn in that state, is the belief. It appears that, especially for animals, it would require some measure of fasting, as well as being nonviolent. But there's also the idea that some souls could remain in this stage for eternity, that you're constantly reborn as an animal or a plant. The final type of being are the infernal beings. These are beings that live in hell. Living in hell, existing in hell, is a time of continual suffering. In hell, you cannot really engage in any sort of spiritual pursuits because it's believed that you would be constantly fighting with the other beings in hell. You end up there instead of as an animal or plant because you have been so given to violence, sin, to falsehood, that you bypass the animals and plants and end up in hell. Residence in hell, however, is not eternal either. Much like being a heavenly being, you're only there for a short amount of time. Not a short amount of time. It could be centuries, right? You're a limited amount of time. It's not eternal, but the idea is that the worse you are, the longer you will be there. After your time in hell, you're reborn into the middle realm, either as a five-sense animal or a human being. You will not be reborn back into heaven. I suppose it's possible you can come back. You do so poor in that next life. One is reborn into this realm due to bad karma, and is reborn out once a sufficient amount of that karma has been burned off. Questions about conceptions of the universe, the types of beings that exist in January.
Technically, it's possible for anyone to eventually get to the liberation if everything goes well.
Right. Yeah. The idea is that over a successive amount of lives, you'll somehow recognize the need to make changes, but it's really only as a human being that you can learn enough.
Basically, the lower you go, the harder it is.
Exactly. Other questions? Within this goal of liberation and achieving a human rebirth, there are important principles Jains are expected to follow. These here are specifically ones focused on monastics, right, monks and nuns, but they're also important for lay people as well. Although there are a few other principles that are required or expected of householders, for example. Cordovan has a chart in his chapter on Jainism. These are the five that I want you to know for an exam. But as far as other things, if you want to go back and look at that, he gives some other things as to what householders are expected to do. But these are the five I want you to focus on for an exam. But the first is, of course, nonviolence. One should not destroy animal life and should destroy plant life only sparingly. Right? So again, the intention of causing harm is very important, but the ability to refrain from all harm is next to impossible. Right? And so there's this kind of recognition that will produce harm, all around us. So the lack of intention to cause harm is just important as well.
So would they consider just basic farming, and like when they till up the ground, so would that be considered violence to the?
It could, right? Because you don't know what's living in that soil, and so you could end up, severing a worm or something like that. So there's a recognition, but you're not intended to cause harm, so that's important. And thinking about some other things, water is to be strained to kind of get out any organisms. But then some would also encourage boiling, but boiling would kill the microorganisms, right? So there's a lot of things that are trying to be done to try and decrease the amount of violence. But there is that recognition that you're going to do some sort of violence, some sort of harm. Then again, some of the regulations that are presented are not always observed, to the extremes. Also very important is truthfulness, which is of course not lying, but also not intending to mislead, trying to be exact in your speech. Lying is only permitted if the truth would inspire or result in violence. And so if you know, for example, let's say Nazi Germany, not that there were Jains in Nazi Germany, but the idea, right? And so you're hiding Jews, and the Nazis come to ask you if there are any Jews hiding in your house. In that type of situation, you know that if you tell the truth, it's going to result in violence. So that would be a situation where you could lie and not bring any sort of ethical problem upon yourself. Non-stealing, a third principle. For some, they go to the extreme of not taking anything that belongs to someone else, meaning that anything. Right? For others, it means if it's been given voluntarily, you can take it. Where and for someone, well, it belongs to you, I don't want to take it, even if it's being offered. Right? So some variety on that. Sexual purity, very important as well. Monastics especially, but sexual purity also important for householders, lay people. Not complete abstinence, obviously, but there is the expectation that only having sexual relationships with a spouse or spouses where polygamy is accepted. There is, however, an emphasis on trying to be as celibate as possible. Monks and nuns are to give up even any sort of thoughts that border on sexual activity. And then the fifth principle is that of non-possession. That's both giving up possessions, but also giving up the desire for possessions. Jains are to own very little, to give away what they can. Among lay people, the emphasis is on limiting food and clothing. And as we've talked about, even monastics are kind of expected to renounce everything, some of them even clothing. However, when you look at society, there are quite a lot of Jains who are very wealthy. And so we have this kind of contrast, right? The emphasis on renunciation, but there's worldly success, otherworldly focus, but this worldly achievement. But essentially the idea is that the world surrenders its bounty to those who conquer it through detachment. And so even though you might have a lot, the emphasis is on being detached from it. Let's close Jainism with talking about some aspects of Jain practice. Rather interesting practice within Jainism is that of salikana, or fasting unto death, which means what it sounds, right? Fasting to the point of death. Now, obviously, this is an ideal that only the holiest in Jainism participate in. It's not considered to be suicide, but instead it's encouraged, or not encouraged, but it's recognized as kind of a dispassionate welcoming of death. The ultimate expression of restraint from violence, that you're so committed to nonviolence that you are not going to harm any animal or plant life for you to survive. Important for many Jains as well is a devotion of those victorious ones, the Jinas. Images of Jinas may be revered, have special places at the temple, at home. Similar to some of the things we talked about in Hinduism, of the shrines in the house, but it's not believed that there's anything divine about the image. But they are used as a remembrance about the opportunity of liberation. Jains, however, also will worship other Hindu deities like Lakshmi, for example, the goddess of good fortune. But Jainism, in its philosophy, is essentially atheistic, because even deities are limited, are not eternal. A very important practice within Jainism is that of pradikramana. The term means something like turning back. It is the idea is that it's kind of turning back away from your sins, turning back to virtue. Usually, as a holiday, which is celebrated, it's a time of confession, reconciliation. Ideally, the practice is to be performed often, but it is to be performed at least once a year. You're to kind of recognize the things that you've done and make changes. Jains will also engage in pilgrimage, sometimes by themselves, sometimes in groups. And of course, as we talked about with Hinduism, some of the same places that are pilgrimage spots for Hindus are pilgrimage spots for Jains, hills and mountains, sites connected to those Tirthankaras. Another rather popular site is this 57-foot statue of Batubali, who was a son of a Tirthankara. He is remembered for this great moment of renunciation. And so every 12 years, a scaffold is built, and pots of water, fragrance, coconut, and sugar are poured down over the statue. You can see it there. There are also some Jain temples. We talked about that as well. What questions do you have about Jainism?
What's the significance of everything being poured down the statue?
Just kind of, I think it has to do with the idea of cleansing, just washing, the idea of being, there might be some ideas of, the blessings of the water and all that kind of stuff. That's my guess. I'm not wrong. Other questions? There are around 5 million Jains in the world, maybe a little bit higher than that. So it's a smaller religion compared to some of the others that we're talking about. In the United States, probably we're talking only in the hundreds of thousands. Probably some as around 400,000, I think, is the number that Corderon puts in his book, and that's a couple of years old.